I forgot to pull up my slideshow. Here we go. Next to uh, run-on sentences, fragments are the next biggest error that I see in my college students' papers, and so that's why we're going to spend some time looking at them today. So what is a fragment? A fragment is a sentence that can't stand on its own. Let's look at some examples. A fragment is, period. That's a fragment. A sentence that can't stand on its own, that's a fragment too. A fragment is a sentence that can't stand on its own. That's not a fragment. But not a fragment is a fragment. This is not a fragment is not a fragment. And this is not a fragment is not a fragment. But neither is this is a fragment. We could keep going forever, but how can we identify when fragments are happening? You look for that subject and verb combination, but more importantly, look to see if it expresses a complete thought. Go back to that idea of sentence chunking that we looked at right at the beginning and try to decide, well, does this chunk of words express a complete thought? If it doesn't, it may be a fragment. There are common culprits for fragments, including present participles, conjunctions, prepositional phrases, and lists or examples. And I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. So a present participle, that's our first culprit. Those are phrases that begin with an ing verb. So a lot of times I'll see something that looks like this. Writing as fast as he could, period. That is a dependent clause. It needs to be connected with something else. And because of that, it's a fragment since it ends with that period there. Instead, we need to try to connect it with a complete idea. Writing as fast as he could, Chris outlined everything he knew. When you have a present participle as a dependent clause, you go ahead and follow that with a comma between that and your independent clause. You can rearrange the order of these phrases, and even if you do that, if this is ends with a period, if these two phrases end with periods, they're still fragments. In the case of, but you can also put these two ideas together and create a complete sentence that can fix those fragments by pulling them together. Notice again, we have a comma separating those two clauses. Another type of culprit that causes fragments are conjunctions or linking words. There are two types of conjunctions, one which you are familiar with probably, fanboys, for and nor, but, or yet so, and subordinating conjunctions, after, although, as if, etc. Those subordinating conjunctions should be listed on our grammar and punctuation handout, so if you need to look at that, you can look at it there. So these conjunctions, if you have a phrase beginning with one of those, it needs to be connected with another phrase that is an independent clause. So because she was so good at sports, period, well, that kind of leaves us hanging. Because she is so good at sports, what? It's a fragment. So we have to connect it with another idea. Because she was so good at sports, Linda tried out for the soccer team. Notice that we have our comma here, because she was so good at sports, comma, Linda tried out for the soccer team. But in the case, if we rearrange the order, Linda tried out for the soccer team because she was so good at sports, we actually don't include a comma between those two. You can still rearrange them, but they need to be punctuated slightly differently. Another culprit for fragments are prepositional phrases. So prepositional phrases begin with a preposition and can act as either an adjective or adverbial phrase. Again, this list of prepositions is available on our editing handout. Here's another fuller list for you to look at. You can look at it in your own time. So, this third culprit, the prepositional phrase, it's a phrase that begins with a preposition. At this case, it's at the Christmas pageant. If we have a period there, if we're left hanging at the Christmas pageant, what? So we can fix it by connecting it to a independent clause. At the Christmas pageant, someone knocked over a candle and started a fire. When you have a prepositional phrase at the beginning of a sentence, you do end that phrase with a comma, dividing up the dependent clause from the independent clause. You can also move that prepositional phrase to the end of the sentence, but in that case, you don't need that comma separating the two phrases. I know, isn't that just wonderful? Everything is so clear in the English language. So another type of culprit for creating fragments are set up with lists or examples. So words to look out for, such as, for example, or including. So here's what one of these kinds of fragments look like, such as run-ons, comma splices, and fragments. So this list of examples needs to be connected with an independent clause. The teacher helps students understand common punctuation errors, comma, such as run-ons, comma splices, and fragments. Again, here we do need a comma. You can also set it up this way. The teacher helps students understand common punctuation errors, period. For instance, they practiced editing example papers. Well, what's the difference here? It's an example, right? Well, right here we have our independent clause. They practiced editing example papers. In this case, we have two independent clauses and they work. So let's look at this more carefully. Such as run-ons, comma splices, and fragments. That's our fragment. For instance, comma, they practice editing example papers. So the difference being this is a setup as a list without our main subject and verb, but here we have our main subject and verb. So just to reiterate, these are the main culprits for creating fragments. I find this a lot more challenging to teach, and students find it hard to understand. But sometimes the way that I like to think about fragments is if you sound like William Shatner going with your long pauses between phrases, or long here I'm going to do my fragment lecture all of a sudden, I don't know, something like that. If it seems like it's really broken up, then it may be a fragment. Have any questions about this or anything else? I'd love to talk about it, and good luck.